In the year 1841, Vienna stood as one of Europe's most dazzling capitals, a city where glittering ballrooms echoed with the music of Strauss, where the grand facades of palaces and opera houses seemed to gleam with eternal light. It was a hub of culture, refinement, and progress, a city proud of its musicians, philosophers, and physicians. But beneath that polished exterior, Vienna harbored shadows that were rarely spoken of in polite company. Behind closed doors, there were rumors of secret societies, occult experiments, and strange artifacts that defied explanation. And among these whispered tales, one story still lingers like a ghost in the city's history, the story of the ledger that wrote its own secrets. At first glance, the object appeared mundane. A large, heavy book, its leather binding cracked with age, its pages yellowed but intact. There was nothing extraordinary about its appearance that would make anyone stop and stare. Yet the aura it carried was unmistakable. For this ledger was no ordinary book. It was said to inscribe events before they occurred, filling its own pages with entries no hand was ever seen to write. The chilling idea of a book that could outpace time itself terrified some and fascinated others. In a city caught between rational science and ancient superstition, such a thing could never remain unnoticed for long. The origins of the ledger remain murky even to this day. Some accounts claim it was first discovered during the liquidation of a minor nobleman's estate, where it lay forgotten in a cellar, wrapped in cloth as if someone had tried to seal it away. Others insist it came from a monastery archive, an item the church itself had attempted to suppress but lost during the upheavals of the 19th century. Whatever the truth, by 1841 it was in Vienna's hands, and the whispers began to spread. What gave the rumors such weight was not merely the fantastical claims made about the book, but the uncanny timing of the events written within it. Fires, accidents, even deaths. Entries bearing the exact date and detail would appear days before they unfolded. Skeptics dismissed these tales as exaggerations, while others insisted that the ledger had been seen, touched, and read with their own eyes. The fascination with the ledger was not merely the curiosity of idle minds. Vienna in the early 19th century was a place where science was racing forward but still struggling to break free from centuries of mysticism. Medicine was advancing rapidly. Vienna's General Hospital was one of Europe's greatest centers of learning. Yet even there, physicians debated theories of animal magnetism, mesmerism, and invisible forces thought to influence the human body. It was a world where rationality and the occult lived side by side, each borrowing from the other. And so the ledger fell into a perfect storm, a culture obsessed with knowledge, fearful of superstition, and secretly intrigued by the idea that fate itself might be written down. Those who first heard of the ledger's strange powers were split in their reactions. Some believed it was nothing more than a hoax, a trick designed to fool gullible minds. Others saw it as proof of divine power or, more dangerously, of diabolical influence. The clergy warned that such an artifact could only come from demonic sources, while intellectuals tried to examine it as a curious problem to be solved. But all agreed on one thing: the ledger carried with it an air of danger. To consult it was to tempt forces beyond human comprehension, and those who possessed it often found themselves plagued by misfortune. Imagine living in Vienna in 1841, hearing rumors of a book that could outpace reality. Would you seek it out, hoping to glimpse the future written on its pages? Or would you turn away in fear, afraid that knowing too much might unravel your own fate? This was the dilemma the people of Vienna faced, and it created a sense of unease that rippled through the city. Because if the ledger truly existed, it posed a terrifying question. Were human lives simply lines of ink already inscribed, waiting to unfold with no hope of alteration? The story of the ledger endures not simply because of its alleged supernatural qualities, but because it represents something deeply unsettling about human nature. The desire to know what comes next is irresistible, yet the possibility of seeing it with certainty is unbearable. We long for knowledge, but recoil from inevitability. And in 1841, a city brimming with both science and superstition found itself staring at that paradox in physical form, a book that should not exist, yet somehow did. This introduction is only the beginning of a tale that wins its way through the streets of Vienna's high society and into the hidden chambers of its occult underground. A tale of scholars, priests, and opportunists who each sought to use the ledger for their own ends, only to encounter the chilling consequences of meddling with something beyond comprehension. Some saw it as a gift, others as a curse, and still others as a test of faith. But all agreed on one thing: the ledger that wrote its own secrets was no ordinary artifact, and its presence in Vienna would leave a trail of unanswered questions and broken lives. And so, as we begin this journey, Keep in mind the uneasy balance that defined the age: a city of brilliance haunted by shadows, a society pushing toward enlightenment yet unable to escape its fascination with the supernatural. In that fragile space between progress and superstition, the ledger emerged, daring to inscribe its own place in history. The question we must ask ourselves is this: what truths did it hold, and what price was paid by those who dared to read them? In 1841, Vienna was a city of contradictions. On the surface, it shone like the very crown jewel of the Habsburg Empire. Its wide boulevards bustled with carriages carrying noble families to glittering balls, and its grand concert halls echoed with the soaring melodies of Johann Strauss and Franz Liszt. In the coffee houses, intellectuals debated politics, philosophy, and science, their words shaping the currents of modern Europe. To outsiders, Vienna seemed a city perched at the pinnacle of refinement, a beacon of culture and progress. But behind the grandeur, there existed another Vienna, one of back alleys, smoky taverns, whispered secrets, and strange beliefs that refused to die in the age of enlightenment. Vienna at this time was the home of two powerful forces: the dazzling advancements of modern thought and the stubborn persistence of the old world. On one hand, its medical schools were the envy of Europe, drawing students from every corner of the continent to study anatomy, surgery, and new approaches to disease. On the other, this same city was gripped by fascination with spiritualism, mesmerism, and the occult. In the quiet chambers of aristocratic palaces, séances were held where mediums claimed to channel the dead. In secret lodges, men whispered about alchemy, esoteric rites, and books that promised forbidden knowledge. Vienna was a place where superstition and science did not merely coexist, they clashed, intertwined, and sometimes became indistinguishable. The political atmosphere of Vienna also played a role in this duality. The city was under the strict control of Prince Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian statesman who had dominated European politics since the fall of Napoleon. Metternich's regime valued order above all, and the secret police kept a close watch on radicals, revolutionaries, and intellectual dissent. Censorship was heavy, and free speech was carefully monitored. But oppression has a strange effect: it drives curiosity into the shadows. And so, while Vienna presented itself as orderly and controlled, beneath its surface it simmered with forbidden books, hidden gatherings, and stories that could never appear in official records. The legend of a ledger that wrote its own secrets fit perfectly into this climate of suppressed whispers and underground obsession. The city's fascination with pseudoscience and the paranormal was not unique, but it was particularly intense. The teachings of Franz Mesmer, who had popularized the idea of animal magnetism, still influenced doctors and charlatans alike. Mesmer's theories claimed that invisible forces could control the body and mind, and his ideas spread far beyond medicine, feeding into a broader European obsession with unseen powers. Phrenology, the belief that personality could be read from the bumps of the skull, also took root in Vienna, attracting both scientific minds and fortune-tellers. These so-called sciences blurred the line between rational inquiry and mystical speculation, leaving the public uncertain of where knowledge ended and magic began. Into this atmosphere, the appearance of a book that could predict, or dictate, the future seemed both impossible and inevitable. Culturally, Vienna was a city of deep contrasts as well. Its aristocracy reveled in excess, hosting extravagant masquerades where guests wore masks not just on their faces but in their lives. Yet outside the palaces, the poor crowded into cramped tenements, their daily existence marked by disease, hunger, and superstition. For the working classes, tales of cursed objects and prophetic books carried a different weight than they did for scholars or nobles. Where intellectuals might see the ledger as a puzzle, common folk might see it as a warning or an omen, a reminder that destiny was cruel and beyond human control. Religious influence added yet another layer to this complex city. The Catholic Church remained a powerful institution in Vienna, but even within its walls, doubts and contradictions flourished. Some priests denounced occult practices as satanic temptations, while others, more quietly, were fascinated by them. The Church was well aware of Europe's long history of dangerous books, grimoires, heretical manuscripts, and so-called cursed texts that had circulated in whispers for centuries. If a ledger capable of writing on its own had appeared in Vienna, it would not have been ignored by the clergy. The tension between condemning such an object and secretly studying it mirrored the larger contradictions of the age. To truly understand the legend of the ledger, one must picture Vienna as it truly was in 1841, a city draped in silk and shadow. Its streets glowed with the elegance of carriages and lanterns, but in the corners of those same streets, beggars muttered prayers and curses in equal measure. In the same neighborhood, One could hear the divine notes of an orchestra and the hushed murmur of an underground séance. Knowledge and superstition walked hand in hand, each feeding the other in strange and unexpected ways. It is in this atmosphere that the ledger appeared. For a book that defied rational explanation, Vienna was fertile ground. The doctors wanted to test it, the nobles wanted to own it, the priests wanted to condemn it, and the common people wanted to fear it. All of them, in their own way, gave life to the legend. The city itself was divided between those who believed the future was in human hands, and those who believed it was already written by forces far beyond comprehension. And so, when whispers of the ledger spread through Vienna's coffeehouses, libraries, and salons, they struck a deep chord. To some, it was simply another tale in a city already full of them. But to others, it was the most terrifying possibility of all, that within those pages, their own fate might be waiting, written in ink, unchangeable and absolute. Vienna in 1841 was a city both ready and unready for such a book. A city that prided itself on reason, yet secretly longed for mysteries. A city of splendor and shadows, into which the ledger would step like a ghost, leaving behind a trail of unease that no music or masquerade could ever drown out. The precise moment the ledger entered Vienna's consciousness is cloaked in uncertainty, as though even history itself hesitates to commit the truth to paper. What is certain, however, is that by the early months of 1841, whispers of a strange book had begun to ripple through the city. A book no scholar claimed to have written, no scribe remembered binding, and no library catalogue ever recorded. Its presence was first noted not in the halls of learned institutions, but in the darker corners of the city, where rumor takes root before fact can even catch its breath. One account suggests the ledger was uncovered during the clearance of a minor noble's estate just outside Vienna. The nobleman, whose name appears inconsistently in records, sometimes as Baron R., sometimes merely as a retired official, had died without heirs. His belongings were sold at auction, as was the custom, and among the stacks of faded books, silver trinkets, and oil portraits, the ledger appeared. Its binding was rough and utilitarian, not the gilded leather one would expect in an aristocrat's library. It looked, in fact, almost neglected, as if it had been deliberately hidden rather than proudly displayed. Yet the moment the book was opened, its strangeness became clear. Another version of the story places its origins in a monastery, hidden deep within ecclesiastical archives. Supposedly, it had been locked away in a chest marked non legere, Latin for not to be read. When the monastery was dissolved during one of the church's periodic reorganizations, the book was lost, resurfacing only when a careless archivist failed to recognize its significance and sold it as part of a bulk lot. If this tale is true, the ledger had already been suppressed once, only to claw its way back into the world. The earliest descriptions of the object all agree on one point. It was a thick, heavy volume, bound in cracked brown leather, its cover unadorned save for faint impressions of symbols that seemed to shift depending on the light. The pages were yellowed but intact, bearing handwriting so neat and uniform it seemed mechanical. But what set it apart were the dates. The entries were all written in chronological order, each dated clearly, but the events they describe had not yet occurred at the time they were first seen. The first example cited by those who came into contact with the ledger was chilling in its simplicity. On one page, an entry described a fire in a bakery on the corner of Kärntner Strasse, specifying the time, the date, and the destruction of an adjoining apartment. Days later, the fire occurred, exactly as written. What unsettled people was not only the accuracy of the event but the timing. According to several accounts, the page had been inspected days earlier, before the fire ever broke out. The words seemed to anticipate reality, mocking the very concept of causality. The ledger did not write in grand pronouncements or sweeping prophecies, but in mundane, almost bureaucratic detail. It recorded the deaths of servants, the bankruptcy of small merchants, minor scandals among the nobility. This gave it an eerie credibility, for unlike dramatic predictions, the ledger's entries were too trivial, too specific, to be dismissed as coincidence. Each time a new owner attempted to dismiss it as a forgery or fabrication, the book would quietly record something they could not ignore. The first scholars to examine it, a group of archivists and amateur historians, were divided. Some suggested the entries were added afterward, in invisible ink that was revealed at the right moment. Others believed a confederate was slipping into the book to write them. But all of these explanations faltered when they realized the handwriting never varied. Every entry was inscribed in the exact same hand, at the exact same angle, with the same unerring precision. Even professional scribes, trained to replicate letters, admitted they could not sustain such uniformity across hundreds of pages. Rumors spread quickly, as they always do in cities where gossip carries as much weight as fact. Patrons in coffeehouses told each other stories of the ledger, each tale more embellished than the last. Some claimed it wrote in the dead of night, its ink fresh by morning, though no one had seen the pen move. Others swore they had watched the faint outline of words appear slowly across the page, like invisible writing surfacing under heat. A few insisted the ledger could be made to reveal secrets by asking it questions, though whether these were answered or merely discovered in later entries was never clear. The clergy, predictably, declared it a work of the devil. Priests warned that no book could contain such knowledge unless it was guided by dark forces. Yet this only made it more desirable. Vienna's nobility, ever hungry for curiosities to amuse their guests, whispered about acquiring it for their salons. Wealthy collectors dispatched agents to track down its whereabouts, hoping to own the ultimate object of mystery. Even some doctors, men trained to believe in rational science, were intrigued, imagining that perhaps the ledger contained some hidden natural law, a mechanism by which the future could be foreseen. It did not take long for the ledger's reputation to become entangled with fear. Those who touched it often reported unsettling dreams, filled with symbols and faces they did not recognize. A banker who acquired the book briefly boasted of using it to anticipate financial shifts, only to lose his fortune in a sudden collapse. A young scholar who spent weeks poring over its pages was found fevered and delirious, muttering that the book is still writing. A servant claimed to have seen her own death listed in its pages. Weeks later, she was crushed in a carriage accident, just as the ledger had recorded. By mid-1841, the ledger was no longer just an oddity, it was a story that haunted Vienna. It passed quietly from hand to hand, each owner more hesitant than the last, until it became less a possession and more a burden. Those who touched it felt its weight in more ways than one, as if the book was not merely made of paper and leather, but of dread itself. And with every new entry, the boundary between history and fate seemed to blur a little further. Thus the ledger's discovery was not a single moment but a spreading infection, a rumor that took root in Vienna's consciousness and refused to die. From auctions and archives, whispers and warnings, it emerged into the city like a shadow cast across its golden facade. In a place obsessed with both progress and superstition, the appearance of such an artifact was both unthinkable and inevitable. And as the ledger began its journey from hand to hand, it left behind not answers, but questions that no one in Vienna was prepared to face. The ledger did not remain in one pair of hands for long. Like a restless spirit, it seemed destined to move from owner to owner, leaving behind a trail of misfortune that grew darker with each transfer. In Vienna's gilded salons and shadowed alleys alike, people spoke of its curse in hushed voices. Yet, curiously, despite its ominous reputation, there were always those willing to take possession of it. Perhaps it was greed, perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the human belief that one can escape the fate that ensnares others. But no matter the reason, the ledger never failed to exact its toll. The first confirmed owner after its reappearance was a wealthy banker, a man known for both his ambition and his arrogance. To him, the ledger was not a curse but an opportunity. If the book could truly foretell events, then surely it could be used to predict the rise and fall of markets, to guide investments, and to secure untold wealth. At first, his experiments appeared to work. He avoided a sudden financial crash that ruined his competitors, sold his shares just before the collapse, and whispered to associates that his secret was nothing more than superior foresight. But the ledger gave nothing without taking something in return. Within months, his fortune crumbled through a chain of misfortunes so bizarre it defied explanation. Shipments lost at sea, contracts nullified by sudden deaths, and trusted allies turning against him. By the end of the year, the once proud banker was ruined. Some say he died penniless, others that he vanished, leaving only the ledger behind. From there, the book passed to a young physician at Vienna's General Hospital, a man fascinated by the unexplained. He believed the ledger was a case study in collective delusion, or perhaps a clever forgery designed to trick the gullible. Determined to expose it, he spent long nights in his study, comparing its entries to newspaper reports and hospital records. But the more he investigated, the more unsettled he became. The ledger contained details too obscure to dismiss, illnesses of unknown patients, outbreaks yet to occur, and even his own notes of experiments that he had not yet written. Friends recalled his growing paranoia. He claimed the ledger anticipated his very thoughts. One winter morning, he was found dead at his desk, the book open before him, his quill frozen in his hand. The official cause was declared heart failure, but in whispered conversations, people claimed he had seen something in its pages that killed him before his heart stopped beating. The clergy, too, tried their hand with the ledger. A Jesuit priest, convinced it was the work of the devil, seized the book in an effort to destroy it. He locked himself in his quarters, reciting prayers of exorcism while attempting to burn its pages. Yet the fire would not catch. The smoke filled the room, but when the flames died down, the ledger remained untouched, its leather blackened but its pages unscathed. Days later, the priest himself was gone. Some records say he was reassigned to a remote posting and never returned. Others insist he was found wandering the streets, muttering incoherently about ink that bleeds but never burns. Whatever his fate, the ledger reappeared weeks later, as if it had never left Vienna at all. Another tale tells of a noblewoman, a patron of the arts and known collector of rare curiosities. She kept the ledger locked in a glass case, treating it less as a dangerous artifact and more as an object of fascination. Guests at her soirees whispered eagerly about it, daring each other to touch the case or glance at its pages. The noblewoman herself insisted she never read from it, claiming she respected its power too much to meddle. But the ledger does not need to be read for its influence to seep into lives. By the end of 1841, one thing was certain: the ledger was no ordinary artifact, but something that defied both explanation and control. And with each misfortune it left behind, it tightened its grip on Vienna's imagination, ensuring that its legend would endure long after its pages had gone silent. Not everyone in Vienna accepted the ledger's reputation as a cursed or supernatural artifact. The 19th century was, after all, an era of rapid scientific discovery, a time when rationalism was celebrated and superstition increasingly dismissed as relics of the past. For many intellectuals, the stories surrounding the mysterious book were not evidence of the paranormal but rather a challenge, a puzzle that could, with enough effort, be solved through the careful application of reason. If the ledger contained accurate predictions, then it was not a tool of the devil or a haunted relic but a document whose workings might be explained by science, psychology, or even mathematics. The first to attempt such an explanation were the physicians of Vienna's famed medical community. The city was home to some of Europe's most advanced hospitals and universities, where doctors and scholars debated endlessly about the nature of life, disease, and the human mind. To them, the ledger offered a peculiar opportunity. Could it be that the book's predictions were simply astute observations written in a way that made them appear prophetic? If a physician recorded symptoms with precision, for example, he might anticipate an outbreak before others recognized the signs. In this way, the ledger could have been the work of a highly skilled doctor, someone whose clinical eye allowed him to foresee deaths and illnesses before they were apparent to others. But this explanation quickly faltered. Many entries had nothing to do with medicine at all. They mentioned accidents, fires, drownings, bankruptcies, and betrayals. These were not the sort of things a doctor could predict with medical knowledge. Some argued that the ledger was the work of a statistician, someone who understood probability better than most. If one predicted that a fire will claim a tenement in winter, one could be reasonably certain that at least one such event would occur in Vienna during the cold season. To those unfamiliar with probability, the accuracy of such general predictions might appear uncanny. But the problem was that the ledger was not vague, it was specific. It listed names, dates, and locations, often with such precision that coincidence seemed implausible. This was when mathematicians and logicians began to take interest. Could it be that the ledger operated on hidden patterns? The 19th century was a time when statistics was beginning to emerge as a scientific field, when scholars sought to apply mathematical reasoning to human behavior. Perhaps, some suggested, the book was nothing more than an early experiment in data gathering, a meticulous record compiled by someone with access to police reports, hospital admissions, and church registers. By collecting enough information, one might indeed notice patterns invisible to others. A man who fell into debt might be more likely to meet financial ruin. A child with recurring fevers might soon die of consumption. A tenement plagued by poor wiring might inevitably catch fire. The ledger's apparent prophecies might then be nothing more than the logical outcomes of carefully observed data. Yet even this explanation struggled under scrutiny. When skeptics compared the ledger's entries with official records, they found far too many matches that could not be explained by mere probability. Names appeared in its pages before they appeared in newspapers. Events were described not in broad strokes but with uncanny detail, down to the very hour of their occurrence. One mathematician who tried to chart the accuracy of the ledger's predictions gave up in despair, writing in a letter that the ratios defy probability. If this is the work of human foresight, It is of a caliber unknown to any science I possess. The growing frustration among scientists revealed something deeper. The ledger was not just a puzzle, but a direct challenge to the rational worldview of the Enlightenment. If it was truly supernatural, it threatened the very foundation of reason. To admit that the ledger was beyond explanation was to admit that science itself had limits. Some scholars simply could not accept this. They declared the entire story a hoax, insisting that later owners fabricated tales of prediction to enhance the book's reputation. In their view, the ledger was nothing more than a clever trick that preyed upon gullible minds. But this skepticism was undercut by the fact that so many who possessed the book were reluctant to speak of it publicly, as though even the act of describing it brought danger. One of the most ambitious attempts to study the ledger came from a group of young physicians who gathered in secret at the University of Vienna. Determined to strip the artifact of its supernatural aura, they designed a series of experiments. They agreed to record every entry, compare it to public events, and publish their findings. For a few weeks, the project was carried out with enthusiasm. But then the group dissolved abruptly. Of the original members, one died suddenly in what was described as a carriage accident. Another withdrew from the university entirely. The rest refused to speak of the ledger again. Their notebooks vanished from the archives, leaving behind only rumors that they had seen something in the pages too disturbing to reveal. Despite these failures, the rationalists of Vienna did not stop trying. Their obsession mirrored the superstition they sought to dispel. Instead of priests chanting exorcisms, there were physicians with measuring instruments. Instead of nobles showing it off at soirees, there were scientists huddled in libraries, whispering about data and statistics. And yet, no matter how they approached it, the ledger remained stubbornly unclassifiable. It was not merely a medical record, nor a statistical experiment, nor a forgery. It was something else. Something that absorbed the rational mind as easily as it devoured the superstitious. In the end, the attempts to explain the ledger scientifically had the opposite effect of what their authors intended. Rather than dissolving the mystery, they deepened it. Each failure made the ledger seem more powerful, more dangerous. If even the finest minds of Vienna could not pierce its secret, then surely it was something more than human. By the middle of 1841, the ledger had ceased to be just an artifact. It had become a battleground between faith and reason, superstition and science, each side claiming to interpret it, yet both unable to master it. The book had slipped beyond the reach of ordinary explanation, and in doing so, it had cemented its place in the imagination of the city. For Vienna, the ledger was no longer just a cursed curiosity. It was proof that the world contained mysteries that neither priests nor doctors could fully command. And that, perhaps, was its greatest danger of all. By the summer of 1841, the ledger was no longer just a private curiosity passed among scholars, nobles, and collectors. Its name, and the unsettling stories attached to it, had spilled into the streets of Vienna. Whispers travelled faster than newspapers. In taverns, bakeries, and crowded marketplaces, the common people spoke of a book that could write the future in its own hand. Some said it was bound in human skin. Others swore it was inked with the blood of criminals executed in the city square. And though the details changed with every retelling, the underlying sentiment was the same. Vienna harboured an object that should never have existed. The city, already burdened with poverty, disease, and political tension, was fertile ground for such stories. The common folk lived in cramped tenements where cholera and typhus spread unchecked, where death could visit at any hour. Against such a backdrop, a ledger that seemed to anticipate misfortune was not just frightening, it was believable. To a mother who had lost 2 children to fever, or a tradesman who had watched his livelihood vanish in a fire, the idea that fate was inscribed somewhere in advance seemed almost logical. Life already felt like a script written by unseen hands. The rumors spread with a distinctly dark flavor. Some claimed that those who merely touched the ledger would find their names written within its pages days later, marked beside the cause of their death. Others whispered that the book moved on its own, that when left closed on a desk it would open by itself in the night, the scratching of its quill echoing through the silence of an empty room. Children dared each other to sneak into alleys and chant stories of the writing book, and nurses frightened unruly charges with warnings that if they misbehaved, the ledger would inscribe their name before morning. For the authorities, this was deeply troubling. The Austrian Empire prided itself on discipline and control. Vienna was the crown jewel, a city meant to symbolize order, civility, and progress. The police had long fought against rumors of witches, fortune-tellers, and secret societies. Now, here was a tale that refused to die. They tried to dismiss it as nonsense, even ridiculing those who spoke of it. But in doing so, they only added to the paranoia. If the authorities were denying its existence so vigorously, perhaps they were hiding something even worse. Among the aristocracy, the rumors took a different shape. The salons and parlors of Vienna's elite buzzed with speculation. Some claimed the emperor himself had once consulted the ledger, using it to avoid political disaster. Others whispered that entire families had been ruined by the book when their names appeared within its cursed pages. For nobles who depended on reputation, inheritance, and social connections, such rumors were dangerous. More than one prominent household fell into decline after gossip linked them to the ledger, as though mere association with it tainted their fortune. Meanwhile, the church seized upon the spreading fear. Priests warned their congregations that the ledger was a tool of Satan, a temptation sent to lure men away from faith and toward the false idol of forbidden knowledge. They spoke in sermons of Adam and Eve, of the arrogance of seeking truths meant only for God. Some churches even held special services to shield the faithful from the influence of cursed texts. Attendance surged, as ordinary people, uncertain of what to believe, sought protection from the possibility that their lives might already be inscribed in the pages of an infernal book. But fear has a way of feeding on itself. Soon, strange coincidences began to be attributed to the ledger whether it was involved or not. If a carriage overturned, killing a merchant, some would mutter that his name had been in the book. If a fire broke out in a tenement, rumors spread that the ledger had warned of it weeks before. And when a young woman drowned in the Danube, the whispers grew louder. It was written. She was marked. Such rumors had consequences. Shopkeepers reported seeing customers cross themselves when walking past their doors, muttering that they had once sold paper or ink to a man rumored to have owned the ledger. Children were forbidden from wandering too close to certain houses, said to shelter the cursed volume. Even the city's bookbinders and scribes were not spared. Some began losing business because superstitious clients feared that a book made in their shop might carry the same taint. This climate of dread reached its peak when a sudden rash of death struck one neighborhood in the autumn of 1841. A cholera outbreak claimed dozens of lives, striking swiftly and without mercy. Though doctors insisted it was the same disease that had plagued Vienna before, the people whispered a darker explanation. The ledger had foretold it. Soon, a panic spread through the district. Families fled their homes, others barricaded themselves indoors, and the police struggled to contain riots sparked by the belief that someone among them possessed the cursed book. It was at this point that the ledger became less of a myth and more of a scapegoat. Any unexplained tragedy could be blamed on it. Any misfortune could be traced back to its shadow. And those who had once tried to study it in secret now found themselves in real danger. To be suspected of owning the book was to invite hostility, if not violence. Stories circulated of men beaten in the streets because neighbors claimed they had seen the ledger under their arm. At least one scholar reportedly fled Vienna altogether, abandoning his career rather than endure the suspicion that he had been dabbling in forbidden knowledge. What made the fear so potent was its uncertainty. No one knew who truly held the ledger, or if it had even remained in Vienna. Each rumor contradicted the last. Some claimed it was locked away in a banker's vault, others that it had been smuggled into a monastery, and still others that it had vanished altogether. But in a way, its very absence was more frightening than its presence. If no one knew where it was, then it might be anywhere. Anyone could be its next victim. By late 1841, the ledger had become not merely a story but a symbol of dread, a reminder that fate itself could not be trusted, that death might already be written down, waiting. The whispers had transformed into a collective paranoia that gripped Vienna like a sickness of the mind. It was no longer a question of whether the ledger was real. The question had become whether one's own name was destined to appear in it. And in that sense, the true power of the ledger was not in the ink upon its pages, but in the fear it had inscribed upon an entire city. By the close of 1841, the spread of fear surrounding the ledger had grown impossible for Vienna's authorities to ignore. What had begun as hushed whispers in taverns and salons was now spilling into the streets in the form of riots, accusations, and acts of violence. The police, whose duty was to maintain the order and dignity of the imperial capital, suddenly found themselves chasing shadows, rumors, and phantoms of a book they were not even certain existed. But in a city where superstition carried as much weight as law, perception mattered just as much as reality. The authorities were in a precarious position. If they ignored the rumors, they risked allowing panic to spread unchecked, undermining their control. But if they acknowledged the ledger openly, they risked lending legitimacy to the very thing they wanted to suppress. The Austrian Empire prided itself on discipline, rationality, and the ability of the state to protect its citizens. A cursed book circulating freely through Vienna threatened that image in ways no criminal gang or petty thief could. The police began their intervention with quiet investigations. Informants were dispatched to cafes, markets, and tenement houses to listen for mentions of the ledger. Booksellers and scribes were questioned, their inventories inspected for anything that might resemble the descriptions whispered by the people. A handful of suspicious volumes were confiscated, ledgers, diaries, and journals bound in worn leather, but none contained the ominous writings that rumor had promised. Each seizure only fueled speculation. If the authorities were taking books, then surely they were closing in on the real one. When subtle tactics failed, the response grew harsher. Patrols were increased in districts most prone to panic. Men caught spreading stories about the ledger were arrested for disturbing the peace, some fined, others held in custody as a warning to others. In one notorious incident, a drunken laborer shouted in a tavern that he had seen his neighbor's name written in the cursed book, predicting his imminent death. By the next morning, the accused neighbor was found beaten by a mob who demanded he confess to owning the ledger. The police cracked down brutally, arresting dozens and issuing proclamations that anyone spreading superstitious lies would face imprisonment. But these heavy-handed tactics backfired. Instead of dispelling fear, they created the impression that the authorities were hiding something. The more aggressively the police tried to silence talk of the ledger, the more the people believed that it must be real and dangerous. The ledger had become more than a superstition. It had become a challenge to authority itself. If the state could not control a mere book, what did that say about its ability to govern the lives of its people? Behind closed doors, the situation grew more complicated. Rumors began circulating even within the ranks of the bureaucracy. Clerks in the police archives whispered that they had seen entries from the ledger smuggled into their files, matching the deaths of prominent citizens. A handful of officers even admitted to their superiors that they feared their own names might appear in its pages. Though these confessions were dismissed as nonsense, they revealed a deeper problem. The paranoia infecting the city was beginning to seep into the very institutions meant to contain it. In desperation, some officials turned to the church for assistance. Priests were asked to denounce the ledger more strongly from their pulpits, to frame it as heresy and sin rather than prophecy. Public prayers were organized in afflicted neighborhoods, processions designed to remind the people of divine protection. Yet even this alliance between church and state had its risks. For the more the priests raged against the ledger, the more some citizens became convinced that it truly was a tool of the devil. If holy men took it so seriously, perhaps its power was beyond doubt. By late autumn, the authorities decided on a final, dramatic measure. A public statement was issued by the chief of police, declaring the ledger a fabrication, an imaginary phantom invented by charlatans and agitators. Anyone claiming to possess the book, the statement said, was guilty of fraud and would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The announcement was read aloud in marketplaces and printed in broadsheets distributed throughout the city. But instead of putting the matter to rest, the proclamation only deepened suspicion. For why, the people asked, would the police go to such lengths to deny something that supposedly did not exist? If the ledger was nothing more than a hoax, why issue threats and warnings at all? To the paranoid and the fearful, the proclamation was proof that the state had failed to destroy the book, and was now desperately trying to convince the people it posed no danger. In the weeks that followed, Vienna entered an uneasy stalemate. The authorities continued their quiet search for the ledger, while the people continued their quiet fear of it. No arrests could stop the whispers, no proclamations could erase the unease. The more the state tried to crush the legend, the more it spread underground, moving from taverns to private parlors, from public gossip to secretive exchanges. The ledger, whether real or not, had achieved something few objects ever could. It had undermined the confidence of an empire. A simple book, its origins uncertain, its pages unseen by most, had managed to rattle the machinery of law, faith, and order. The authorities had intervened, yes, but in their struggle to silence the rumor, they had only amplified its echo. And in that silence, when patrols passed by and curfews dimmed the streets, Vienna's citizens still wondered the same thing. Was their name already written in the ledger, waiting for the hour when fate would claim them? The turning point came quietly, almost without notice. Sometime in the bitter cold of late December 1841, the ledger that had consumed Vienna's imagination, haunted its taverns, and filled its churches with trembling congregations, simply vanished. To this day, no one can say with certainty how it slipped from the city's grasp. Some claimed the police seized it in a midnight raid, whisking it away to a hidden archive where it could be studied, or suppressed, forever. Others insisted it was stolen from its last known owner by a shadowy figure, a thief who melted into the winter fog and was never heard from again. Still others whispered that the book had no need of human hands, that it had returned to wherever it came from, leaving behind only fear in its wake. The first signs of its disappearance emerged in gossip among Vienna's book dealers. For weeks, some of them had been approached discreetly by men who inquired about rare manuscripts, always describing the same strange volume, old, bound in worn leather, filled with handwriting that seemed to shift or grow between readings. Then, abruptly, these visits ceased. Those who had previously spoken of the book grew silent. Collectors who had bragged about knowing its whereabouts now denied ever mentioning it. Even the police, once so eager to denounce or confiscate suspicious tomes, appeared suddenly uninterested. It was as though the ledger had been wiped clean from the city's consciousness, leaving only an anxious void in its place. But disappearance did not mean relief. If anything, the absence of the ledger deepened the paranoia. Before, the people of Vienna could at least console themselves with rumors of its location. They could imagine it locked away in some aristocrat's study, or buried in the archives of the university, or hidden in the vaults of the police. Its danger, while terrifying, felt contained. Now, with no clear trace of it, the book might be anywhere, or nowhere. For many, that uncertainty was worse than knowing. Theories multiplied, each darker than the last. Some believed the ledger had been deliberately destroyed. They told of a priest who, horrified by what he had seen in its pages, smuggled it to a remote monastery and burned it in a fire that raged for 3 days, the smoke carrying with it the stench of charred leather and ink. But skeptics countered that if it had truly been destroyed, the fear surrounding it would have faded. Yet the city remained restless, its people still whispering of names and fates. Another theory claimed that the book had never been a physical object at all, that it was an idea, a collective hallucination born of Vienna's hunger for stories in an age of disease, upheaval, and dread. According to this version, the ledger's disappearance was not a vanishing act but a transformation. It had dissolved into rumor, spreading beyond the city in the form of folktales and cautionary stories, no longer bound to pages but inscribed in the minds of all who feared their futures were already written. And yet, the most unsettling accounts came from those who swore they had still seen the ledger after its supposed disappearance. A soldier stationed near the Hungarian border told of encountering a tattered book in an abandoned inn, its pages marked with names he recognized from his regiment, men who later perished in battle. A merchant claimed to have glimpsed it in Prague, offered quietly in a backroom sale, though he dared not touch it. Each of these stories was impossible to verify, but they ensured that the ledger never truly left Vienna's imagination. If it could vanish once, it could reappear again, anywhere, at any time. The official records from the period are maddeningly silent. Not a single entry in police archives mentions the book after December 1841. The sudden absence of documentation suggests one of two things. Either the authorities never had the ledger at all, or they suppressed every trace of their involvement with it. The latter possibility fueled generations of conspiracy theorists who claimed the Austrian Empire had hidden the book away, terrified of the chaos it might unleash if the truth became public. Some even suggested it was locked deep within the imperial vaults, guarded by silence as much as by stone. For the people, the disappearance marked not an end but a shift in the story. Where once they feared the ledger's presence, now they feared its absence. It had become a ghost that could not be touched, a shadow without form. Parents continued to hush their children with warnings of the book that wrote its own secrets. Tavern storytellers polished its legend, embellishing the tale with each retelling. And for every skeptic who declared it gone forever, there was another who insisted it would return, opening its pages once more to record the fates of the living. This uncertainty became, in time, the very essence of the ledger's power. Objects can be confiscated. Books can be burned. But a story, especially one soaked in fear, cannot be destroyed so easily. The ledger disappeared from Vienna, but it reappeared in the minds of travelers who carried its tale to other cities, in the hushed prayers of the faithful, and in the nightmares of those who believed their names were already written somewhere beyond their reach. By the dawn of 1842, Vienna had grown quieter. The riots subsided, the police returned to ordinary duties, and the cholera outbreak that had fueled the ledger's myth finally passed. On the surface, the city seemed to recover. But underneath that calm, a seed of unease remained. The ledger's disappearance had not erased its influence, it had cemented it. For now, the book was gone. But as every Viennese knew in their hearts, a thing that vanishes so completely often has a way of returning when least expected. And when it did, the city feared, it would not simply write the secrets of men, it would demand payment for having been forgotten. Even after the ledger disappeared from Vienna in the winter of 1841, its shadow lingered long after the book itself was gone. The city had been scarred by its legend, and though the authorities tried to push it into silence, stories have a way of surviving, mutating, taking on new forms with each retelling. Over the decades that followed, the ledger transformed from a physical artifact into a piece of folklore, embedded deep in the cultural memory of Austria and beyond. For ordinary Viennese families, the ledger became a cautionary tale whispered to children. Parents would warn their sons not to pry into matters that did not concern them, lest they end up like those who had sought the cursed book. Daughters were told that curiosity about forbidden knowledge could lead to ruin, just as surely as a name written in the ledger meant death. The book was no longer simply a story about fate, it was a tool of discipline, a way of teaching obedience and humility in a world where uncertainty was already terrifying enough. Within just a few years, the tale of the ledger began spreading beyond Vienna's borders. Travelers carried the story to Prague, Budapest, and Munich. By the 1850s, it appeared in German-language collections of urban legends, often stripped of its specific details and polished into a parable. In these versions, the ledger was sometimes said to predict wars instead of individual deaths, or to inscribe the collapse of dynasties rather than the demise of ordinary citizens. In each telling, however, one element remained constant: the belief that the book wrote by itself and that its pages could not be defied. As folklore, the ledger also began to mingle with older European traditions. Austria already had its share of dark tales, stories of witches, revenants, and cursed objects that brought misfortune to their owners. The ledger was folded into this wider mythology, compared to the grimoires of medieval necromancers and the black books said to circulate secretly among heretics. In some Alpine villages, it was even said that the ledger was the devil's account book, recording debts owed by the souls of the damned. When a villager died suddenly, neighbors might whisper, his name was in the ledger, echoing the old fears that had once swept through Vienna. But folklore has a way of adapting to the anxieties of each generation. In the late 19th century, as Vienna transformed into a modern metropolis of industry, art, and philosophy, the ledger took on new interpretations. Intellectuals of the fin de siècle, fascinated by psychology and the unconscious, began describing it not as a literal book but as a metaphor. Some writers claimed the ledger was a symbol of fate itself, a reminder that our lives were inscribed by forces beyond our control, whether by God, nature, or the hidden mechanisms of the mind. The psychoanalysts who rose to prominence in Vienna would later echo similar ideas, though they cloaked them in the language of dreams and repression rather than curses and prophecy. Yet for every attempt to rationalize it, there were still those who insisted the ledger was real. Strange reports surfaced from time to time. In 1872, a Hungarian newspaper published a story about a book found in a nobleman's library that contained eerily prophetic entries. In 1890, a German traveller claimed to have seen the ledger in a collector's private cabinet, describing it as a thick volume that smelled of mildew and dread. These accounts were impossible to verify, but they ensured that the legend never fully faded. Each new rumour suggested the book had merely shifted locations, slipping like a phantom from one hand to another, leaving behind only whispers. The ledger even found its way into literature. By the early 20th century, it had inspired Gothic novels and stage plays, though the details were often changed to avoid controversy. One popular melodrama depicted the ledger as a family curse passed down through generations, each heir doomed to read their own death in its pages. Another play transformed it into a political allegory, with the ledger recording not names but revolutions, foretelling the collapse of empires. In these works, the ledger became less an artifact and more an idea, a canvas onto which writers projected the fears of their age. During the turmoil of the First World War, the story gained new life. Soldiers on the Eastern Front spoke of a book that recorded the names of entire regiments before they were slaughtered. Some swore they had seen such a ledger in the hands of officers, a secret document that predicted which battles would be lost before they were even fought. Though historians dismissed these as morale-shaking rumours, the echoes of the old Viennese tale were unmistakable. The ledger had become a symbol of inevitability, a reminder that no man could escape the fate awaiting him in the trenches. By the time the Second World War erupted, the ledger's legend had seeped into darker corners. In occupied Austria, there were whispers that Nazi officials had discovered a death book in Vienna's archives and were using it to manipulate fear, pointing to its prophecies as justification for their own brutality. Whether true or not, the rumor itself gave the legend new potency. It was no longer a relic of superstition but a weapon of terror, its name invoked to explain horrors that defied understanding. After 1945, the legend slipped once again into folklore, though it never vanished. Local storytellers still mention the ledger in hushed tones, particularly in rural Austria, where old traditions linger stubbornly against the march of modernity. Tour guides in Vienna occasionally weave it into their ghost walks, pointing out narrow alleys and forgotten libraries where the book was said to have appeared. Scholars of folklore have catalogued it alongside tales of haunted manuscripts and cursed relics, noting how it has evolved with time yet retained its central terror, that one's fate could be written down before it occurred. And perhaps that is why the ledger story has endured for nearly 2 centuries. More than the details of its pages, more than the question of whether it ever truly existed, the ledger embodies a fear that is timeless, the fear that our lives are not our own, that destiny is fixed, and that somewhere, somehow, it has already been decided. Whether in the streets of cholera-stricken Vienna, the trenches of World War I, or the nightmares of modern storytellers, the ledger speaks to the same dread, that no matter how we struggle, our names may already be inscribed, waiting to be read aloud by an unseen hand. In the centuries since its supposed disappearance, the ledger has become more than a relic of Vienna's dark past. It has been reinterpreted, reframed, and reimagined by modern thinkers, artists, and researchers, each seeking to explain, or exploit, the chilling power of its legend. Today, the ledger lives not in libraries or private collections, but in the realms of psychology, philosophy, literature, and even digital culture, where its story has found unexpected new life. Modern historians often treat the ledger as a mirror reflecting the anxieties of 19th century Vienna. To them, it was not necessarily a literal supernatural object but rather a cultural response to an age of immense uncertainty. In the 1840s, Vienna was plagued by epidemics, political unrest, and the creeping realization that human life was fragile and easily lost. Against this backdrop, the ledger symbolized the invisible forces that controlled one's fate. It was, in essence, a book that embodied the terror of mortality, a physical reminder that death could strike without warning. In this interpretation, the ledger is less a cursed artifact and more a collective projection of fear, shaped into story so that people could process the chaos around them. Psychologists, too, have taken interest in the legend. Some see the ledger as a metaphor for fatalism and the human mind's obsession with prophecy. The idea of a book that writes our fate taps into deep psychological instincts, the need for order in randomness, the belief that our destinies are already written somewhere, waiting to be revealed. This interpretation links the ledger to broader patterns of superstition, from horoscopes to divination, showing how humans cling to the idea of preordained meaning even when faced with randomness. In this sense, the ledger functions like a mirror of the unconscious, a symbol of the mind's tendency to seek patterns even in shadows. Philosophers have gone further, using the ledger to discuss questions of free will. If our names can be inscribed in a book before we die, then what room is left for choice, for agency, for rebellion against fate? The ledger raises unsettling questions. Are our lives truly our own, or do we simply act out scripts already written? These debates echo the broader tension between determinism and freedom, between the idea that we are shaped by forces beyond our control, biology, society, history, and the hope that we can still carve out independent paths. To many modern philosophers, the ledger is not a literal artifact but a thought experiment, a terrifying metaphor for the loss of autonomy. In popular culture, the legend has been reborn in countless forms. Gothic writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries inspired horror films and novels that drew from the idea of a self-writing book. Today, television series and internet folklore borrow from the same imagery, stories of cursed documents that predict or even cause death. The ledger has even been compared to works of modern horror like the concept of haunted files or digital curses, where instead of ink, fate is written in binary code. Online forums circulate tales of forbidden PDFs or files that seem to update themselves with the names of those who read them. Though obviously fictional, these digital echoes show how the structure of the ledger legend adapts seamlessly to each new era's technology. Some researchers argue that the ledger has also influenced conspiracy culture. The idea of a hidden book that determines who will live and who will die resonates with modern fears of secret powers controlling the world. Whispers of shadow governments, secret societies, or clandestine databases often echo the same fatalistic dread that once surrounded the Viennese ledger. To believe in the ledger today is to believe that the course of history, and our place within it, is written down somewhere, out of our reach, untouchable, and absolute. Artists have also embraced the ledger as inspiration. In exhibitions, contemporary painters and installation artists have recreated the concept of a self-writing book, using motion sensors or AI-powered scripts that generate names of the dead. These works blur the line between history and imagination, asking viewers to confront the same chill that once gripped Vienna. The ledger has become not only a symbol of death but also of the haunting power of storytelling itself, how a tale, once told, continues to write itself into new forms across centuries. And yet, even with all the rational explanations, the folkloric retellings, and the artistic interpretations, one question lingers. What if the ledger was real? This possibility continues to gnaw at the edges of the legend, fueling ghost tours, books, and documentaries. The lack of physical evidence does not erase the possibility that something existed in Vienna in 1841, something strange enough, or terrifying enough, to plant this story into the cultural imagination so deeply that it still refuses to die. In the end, modern interpretations of the ledger oscillate between skepticism and awe. On one side, it is dismissed as a story born of fear, a metaphor for mortality and fate. On the other, it is treated with reverence, as if the absence of proof only strengthens the allure of its mystery. The ledger, in this sense, has achieved immortality not as an object but as an idea. It no longer needs to exist in any physical form, because its presence lingers in the human imagination, an eternal reminder that somewhere, perhaps unseen, the lines of our lives might already be written.